What are bones made of?
So they're made from quite a few different things. So what most people think of, that white hard substance, that's actually mainly something called calcium and phosphate, and there's some sodium in there. But there's also a lot of protein in bones as well. So there's a protein called collagen, which you might have heard in terms of using for cosmetic surgery, lip fillers, things like that. But it's actually a protein that sits within bone, this mineral, this hard substance made from calcium and phosphate, wraps around it, fills in all the gaps, and thrown in there for some good measure. There's also some cells as well that are controlling and governing everything else that's going on. So they're made from quite a lot of things. So protein, minerals, cells, there's blood, there's nerves, lots of things.
So are bones dead or alive?
Okay, so they are very much alive. So the mineral part of them is dead, as we know it. However, there's plenty of cells, they're definitely alive, but also I think is one of the most interesting things about skeletons is that they constantly change, right from when you're born all the way to the day you die. They change, and they sort of actively adapt to what we put them through. So they're very much alive, and they're changing constantly. No 2 days are ever the same as far as your skeleton's concerned.
Okay, so are teeth a form of bone? Because I mean you can dig them up, and they if you dig up a skeleton, you'll often find the bones remain with the rest of the skeletons. So surely they're bones, aren't they not?
Well, I think to begin with we might have thought they were, but actually when you look into them, there's some very striking differences. So number one, teeth are actually a lot harder than bones. So yeah, you're right, they'll survive being buried for thousands of years. They'll also survive a nuclear blast. Teeth do survive because of the enamel on the outside of them. However, once you go past that, they're very different. So the inside of teeth have something called pulp, and that's very different to sort of the bone marrow and the structure of bone that we find on the inside of bones. And also really importantly, and going back to what I've just said, bones heal, teeth can't.
Of course, you can get teeth decay, and that's your teeth gone.
Dentists would be out of a job if teeth were as good as skeletons at fixing.
Right. So what sort of bone? So what sort of cells do we find in bones? I mean, the cells in our I suppose muscles, for instance, do a certain function. What's kind of the function of the cells in your bones?
Okay, so there's 3 main kinds. One called osteoclasts, one called osteoblasts. And these cells have the job of taking away bone that's damaged or not optimally adapted, and then laying down new bone. So the osteoclasts take the bone away, the osteoblasts put it back. And they're
so why would you want to get rid of bone or take it away?
So when I was saying about it adapt, so if you start doing something new, so you've taken up something like archery in Freshers Week, okay, in your arm that you're pulling back that bow with, you're actually putting very different forces and stresses through not only the muscles. We think about the muscles when you do things in the gym and sport, but you don't think about the bones underneath. The bone needs to change as well. So what happens is on a very microscopic scale, you get little cracks occurring if the bone isn't used to what you're trying to do with it. So it's those cracks that repair. Those cracks are allowed to be there. That's how we constantly adapt our skeleton. But then there's a third kind called osteocytes, and these are very dear to my heart. This is what a lot of my PhD thesis was on. And there are 90% of the cells in the bone are these osteocytes, even though these osteoclasts and osteoblasts have been looked at for well over 100 years. The osteocytes to me are more interesting because what we think they do is they're the cells that can tell what we're doing with our skeleton. So they're the cells that can figure out that we're doing something different, we're putting more forces through our skeleton, and they then tell the other the other cells to start fixing them and making our skeleton stronger.
Okay, so with all these cells in our bones, is it possible to recover DNA from dead bodies? And how long can a body be dug up before you can no longer find DNA in the cells?
So it survives better in teeth, I believe, which is, I think, what we're on about when you're looking about the plague story. But it can survive. So yeah, you do have cells, and they do have a nucleus, so they do have DNA in them. So yes, so when you put a body in the ground, those cells are there that are going to store DNA. How long it's viable for? So if you wanted to sequence the DNA from someone that you dug up, really depends on the conditions that skeleton's been put on. Some conditions, I believe, are a lot better than others. So I think if you were looking at a skeleton that was put in probably the ground in England, where it's quite wet, quite damp, decay happens very, very quickly, you may struggle, I think. But I think people have tried to recover the DNA from cells in bones from things like Egyptian mummies, things like that. There's a big mystery around who Tutankhamun's mum was and things like this, and I think they've tried to recover DNA from different places, and I think they've tried it in bones.
So although the bone is still there and we can still dig up the bone, you're
Yes.
telling me the cells inside the bone are dead?
Yeah, they die, but you can still get DNA from dead things. It just depends how they have deteriorated, whether they've broken down fully, and whether that DNA, that valuable DNA that we need, is in one piece or not, or whether that's started to break down.
So you're talking about the evolution of bones throughout our lives. To what extent does this take place? I mean, how much can it really affect just your skeleton if you've got certain genetic characteristics that will characterize your bones? How much can that change by your environment?
So, like I say, if you're doing a certain activity over and over again, it really does change the bones. So if you dig up a skeleton out of a medieval graveyard, you can often tell if they were an archer or not, because physically you've got no muscles, you don't get a bow buried with them, that'd be too easy to figure that out. But if you've just got the skeleton, you can tell by the size difference in the bones, and they're physically much, much bigger. To do with genetic differences, I suppose, and maybe not specific genetics in certain families, but you do get differences in the skeleton depending on what race you are. So one of my research interests is the spine. So you look at the vertebra that's in the spine, they're very different shapes if you're looking at someone with a Caucasian background as opposed to someone with an Asian background. So these skeletons really, they have a certain amount of programming, but they do adapt to what we do with them day in, day out. And you really see that if they're not adapted.
Right. Okay, so what is osteoporosis, and what's the probability of getting it?
Okay, so osteoporosis. So you may or may not have heard of this disease. It's a disease of the elderly. In most cases, there is a juvenile kind, but I'm just going to talk about the one that you get in old age. So what osteoporosis actually means is porous bone. That's how the word breaks down if you look at like the Latin roots. So what happens is during sort of your early years, your bones get stronger and stronger until you're about 30 years old. We have what we call bone density, which is that hard mineral I was talking about. You get lots of that in your bone, make them nice and strong. And then when you get to about 50, that starts to diminish and the bone density gets less. Now, if that happens just in an extreme case, then you can get osteoporosis. So that's characterised by if you get breakages of the bone when you've not really done anything to warrant a break. So you've not been hit by a car or fallen off a wall or anything like that. People can get breaks when they just roll over in their sleep.
So you're saying basically our bones are only good for 50 years, really. After that, they start to decay and they're no longer necessary.
Yeah, not they're no longer necessary, but we're almost no longer necessary. So evolutionary speaking, once you've had your children and you've mostly raised them, evolutionary speaking, you are pretty useless, unfortunately. So this is why our skeletons haven't overcome the fact that as you get old, they get less competent, they get less strong, and they can get these diseases. So going back to what you're asking about how common it is, so some people have heard of it, some haven't, but 1 in 2 women over the age of 50 will get it, and 1 in 5 men, and those numbers are increasing, and you're more likely to get it in a developed country than a developing country.
That's really interesting. So we think we've got everything perfect here, and really our chances of osteoporosis are greater. In this development.
Yeah, we often associate diseases with developing countries and people that haven't got all this medical knowledge and things like that. But yeah, it's classed as a modern epidemic.
It's a very strange result.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, bones, I'm sure most people know, could recover and can mend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible for broken bones to go unnoticed and recover on their own without us even having to perform any kind of any reparations?
Yeah, they can do. So generally, once you break a bone, it's very, very painful. So if you've not got something like a compound fracture, so compound fracture is when you've broken a bone and one of the bones is sticking through the skin, you're definitely going to notice that. Or if the ends of the bone have slipped past each other, so suddenly your leg is 3 inches shorter than it was before you break it, you notice that. But what we class as a bone can just be like a fracture. And yes, that can go unnoticed. Generally, the pain makes you do something about it. That's normally one of the biggest reasons why you'll go to somewhere like A&E to have something checked out.
There's lots of nerves in bones.
Yeah, there's lots of nerves in bones, so when you break it, those nerves are active. Often all the soft tissue around the outside, the muscles and things, or the ligaments and tendons that hold the bones and the muscles together complain. But so for example, going back to osteoporosis, you can get what we call vertebral body fractures. So bones in the spine can fracture. And currently there's about 120,000 of those fractures reported each year in the elderly. However, there's some research to suggest that maybe only 1 in 4 of those fractures is ever reported. So there could be as many as 500,000 of these fractures every year in the UK alone, with a very small number of them being reported because people put it down to just having back pain.
Well, so it seems as you get older, bones just tend to become more useless and want to break all the time.
Oh yeah, they don't remember to keep strong, I think is the better way.
Well, okay, so are all bones connected to each other? Because we think of, everything's connected, isn't it? Or is it not?
So going back to your news story, the hyoid bone, that hyoid bone you mentioned, is the only bone in the body not connected to another bone. So its job is to depress the tongue, to move the tongue. So it's just there, sat there in the throat. Another fun fact about that bone, well, I think it's fun, is that if someone suspects that someone's been strangled, found someone they're murdered, soft tissue damage isn't really telling them a story, often that hyoid bone will have been fractured. So they'll check whether it's in one piece. Yes, a bit of murder for a Wednesday morning.
Right. So that's it's an isolated bone, but what's the smallest bone in the body?
So the smallest bone, so it's not the smallest bone, and certainly in some monkeys apparently it's bigger than others. So we may or may not know that we have 3 little bones in our inner ear, and they're actually really important for how we hear. So they're called the ossicles. So they're sort of non-scientific words. You may have heard them called the anvil, the hammer, and the stirrup. And it's the stirrup that's called the stapes. That's the smallest bone in the body. So as you imagine, they're in the inner ear, so they really are tiny.
So what sort of size are they, just to conceptualise it? Size of a fingernail? Or?
No, much smaller than that. Much smaller than a fingernail. You can see them, but they won't be much bigger than a little fingernail.
Absolutely tiny then. Okay, so to finish on a fun note, is the funny bone a bone?
There's two thoughts on this one. So the arm bone is called the humerus. So there's an argument that when people refer to the funny bone, they're talking about the humerus because obviously it sounds like humour. However, that feeling you get when you smack your elbow on something and it really hurts and everyone else laughs at you, which is generally why I think it's called the funny bone, but it's actually because it gives you a funny feeling in your arms, specifically your fingers. That's not actually due to a bone, that's due to a nerve that's called the ulnar nerve. It runs down the outside of your elbow and goes to send signals to your ring and pinky finger. So the funny bone is a nerve, it's your ulnar nerve. So when
it's got nothing to do with bones.
No. So when you smack your elbow, you're actually hurting a nerve, which is why it feels so bizarre.